on Friday and doing this the next day.
I know.
It is just it's like we never left. It's like I never
No.
left this damn seat. You know?
Oh, we talked for about an hour and a half last night about Howard. All right, here we go. We are live.
It's probably the longest anybody's ever talked about him in decades, realistically.
Oh, without bashing him.
Well, no, we have to be called a strike. I called balls, I called strikes. I called the good, the bad, and the ugly for old Howard. So that's the way that goes.
I think we both did. I think it's very balanced.
There it is. I found us. No, you got to be balanced. You got to be balanced.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's like, you have someone like him or even someone like Sickles, and it's like you either love them or you hate them. And the funny thing is that we find that Sickles is not very kind to Howard at times. But if you look at, 1900s, Howard celebrates his 70th birthday, and who's there giving a speech but Dan Sickles? So obviously they respected each other, and they went on like this political tour together, I think, when Howard retired, and then they gave talks together out west. And I mean, really, and the one person that is absent, but then again, I'm not shocked by this because of his injuries, is Chamberlain is not really involved.
No, Chamberlain kind of does his own thing, though. Yeah. I mean, you know how it is. I mean, we'll talk about this, but he goes off in his own tangents. He does his own thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a lot of guys that just did their own job, did their work, and went home, and that was the end of the day. Some people promote themselves, and there's nothing wrong with either one. It's just that they were just different people,
No. Good morning, David.
Hey, David.
And I think, as much as we joke around about the Howard stuff, it was good to finally talk about him last night, and because we've given, a lot of attention to different generals that maybe don't have it, like Lytle, like Barksdale, like on both sides of it, right? And Howard's life is, it's one that is so interesting. And I find myself becoming more fascinated with him post-Civil War. Like this morning, I was reading about how he traveled in Europe and Egypt, and he saw like the Great Pyramids. He saw the Sphinx. He saw like Rome, and he said he wanted to go to Rome since he was a little kid. So that is he does this world traveling as well, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. That's how they do it. A lot of these guys do all this stuff. So it's pretty cool. I like studying the people. I like doing the battles too, but I like studying the people, because when you study the people, you can really get in deep with some of these people. And Howard, Howard's a guy, we have fun with old Howard at your expense, admittedly. I know I give you a hard time about him, but I mean, he is what he was. I mean, he was a true progressive, even by today's standards.
Yeah.
I mean, he was, and he must have stood out like a sore thumb, back at Gettysburg. So I think it's one of those things. I think he's the problem with a guy like Howard, and this is the whole thing, right? Is we talked a lot about some of the reputation, and I talked about the historian Ezra Warner, who wrote that book, Generals in Blue, right? Yeah. And a lot of that stuff just sticks, where he just falls on his face, but he always gets carried along. You have the diary stuff of his soldiers who didn't like the religion thing. They overblow Chancellorsville, they really do, and then they paint this narrative of Gettysburg that he somehow screwed up Gettysburg too, which is historically accurate. Mm-hmm. And then when Congress lists him along with Meade and Hooker as the heroes of Gettysburg, it gets the Hancock people going.
Yeah, the Hancock, but it's like Hancock is like why would he even have been named a victor? I mean, I get what he did is good there. And then, Roger's on here. Good morning, Roger.
Hey.
Scott said, good morning. I really loved your Howard discussion. Glowjam said, watch the Filled with Affection 111 last night. Oh, so well done. Wondering about Sickles' motives behind why he would have gone after Howard. I think Sickles went after Meade as well, but I think Sickles loved himself some Sickles too, as well. Nothing against Uncle Dan. Love Uncle Dan. We're, totally team Dan Sickles here. Oh, Frank said, good morning, happy 100. It's 160th of Fort Wagner today, too.
It is. And we'll definitely talk about that. And speaking of another New Englander, right? But this one, unlike Howard, was not much of an abolitionist, but we'll talk about that.
No, and good morning, Lisa. That's the one thing, too, is Howard doesn't get labeled as an abolitionist, but if you read his memoirs, it's quite clear that he is. Oh, good morning, Shanna.
Oh, hey, Shanna. I saw some pictures of Shanna riding horses in Gettysburg.
Yeah, that was really cool. Yeah, she does
I
cavalry.
did that. Not so, I don't want to brag, but I paid for a tour and got
You
to do a
weren't doing
course.
what she was doing. She was
But
actually doing cavalry.
I'm sitting there with my Civil War uniform on. I got my cigar, freaking riding around. Oh God, I was in my head. It was glory. But anyway, that's cool. But no, but
we do talk in the episode about how he's not like, no one says how Oliver Otis Howard the abolitionist. But he clearly was, especially like I was reading his chapters on like Reconstruction this morning, and just his thoughts and how he went into the Freedmen's Bureau and all that is just really, it's quite clear that he was, and he had that from a young age, from his upbringing, just he saw them. There's one quote he has where he basically says, he's like, we have to do the Christian thing and accept them as equals. And he calls out like, he said, why is it that there's this stereotype? It's unfair. And why is it that, the white people are getting praised for being brutal to them? It's like he's calling out kind of this double standard that existed. Good for him, for doing that. But yeah, he's clear. And I think that's one thing that obviously at West Point, that is something that goes against him, because he gets in that fight. And we don't think it was Jeb Stuart that hit him over the head with the bottle. We suspect it was probably, who was it, Custis Lee?
It was, I mean, it's that's tough to say, because the problem with Howard, unlike a lot of people in contemporary times, he doesn't name names. So he gets his ass handed to him by a Confederate, cadet, for defending, the words that someone said about black people, and he doesn't name names. He lies to Lee. He says he got hurt in the gym, probably pumping the iron, that rock body of his, Mary. But that's who he was, though. But it's interesting. It's pretty cool. I mean, he's someone we have some fun with him because the whole thing with you. But I mean, he's definitely a very complex dude.
Yeah,
way more than people think they is. I was reading a historian who said that what he lacked in brains, he made up in personality, and I would disagree with that completely, because I think that's kind of a silly comment, but that's the perception, and a lot of it is because the contemporaries of the time who didn't like the attention he got, some of his soldiers who he rubbed the wrong way, Abner Small from the 16th Maine, notwithstanding, a lot of them did, and then you pick historians like Ezra Warner pick up the ball, guys like Edward Barrs pick up the ball, and it goes from there. And then it turns into this, I don't know, this perception that he did everything completely wrong. But the problem is his real contemporaries at the time, especially guys like Sherman, they took a shine to him. I mean, Samuel Heintzelman didn't like him.
No, Jefferson C. Davis didn't like him.
But I mean, right. But that's the thing. But you can find a case about everybody. And the reality is, like it or dislike it, the religion thing pissed a lot of people off.
It did.
He just did. And there's nothing against obviously religion, but when you're a soldier and you're constantly being pounded upside the head with it, you can see how it would probably get old. Because if you read a lot of the diaries, specifically Abner Small, almost every one of the quotes that I found, every one of them from the soldiers mentions how much the religion thing annoyed them.
Yeah, it bothered them. And I mean, it's funny that, I was reading this one article, and people in the U.S., like the U.S. goes through a couple different religious movements. Howard finds evangelical religion when he's in Tampa, Florida, of all places. I do suspect it's from some of the stuff that he saw there. I think he saw some pretty bad stuff with the Indian wars that were happening with the Seminoles. Yeah. But I think Two, he was very depressed being away from his family. And that's the one quote he woke up on the last day of May, and he said he saw the world completely differently. And I think it was that religion and that faith that brought about more of the abolitionist in him. And he used that as his reasoning for, helping the freedmen, helping the freed slaves. Like, he established so many schools, but he got met with so much resistance from Johnson, from the administration. He had issues with the KKK as well. He writes a whole chapter on all the stuff that is happening. And Sherman writes this thing against, he basically writes him a thoughts and prayers letter, which we read in the episode, basically saying, I know you have good intentions, but good luck with the Freedmen's Bureau. Oh,
he does. Freedmen's Bureau, it's 900 guys, and basically social workers. They're put in the military districts in the 11th former Confederate states. It's under the War Department. And these people, they weren't soldiers. They were people, just people, and they're constantly hounded by the Klan. And you have Andrew Johnson who's doing everything to overturn it.
Yeah.
February of 1866, Congress is going to vote to kick in more money.
Yeah.
And Johnson vetoes it. They override the veto. But what happens? What does Johnson do? He starts firing the people in the thing to undermine him. And that's just what he was.
And then there's like, they had the 48. We didn't talk about this in the episode, but the 40 acres and a mule is like, it's Howard and Sherman that come up with that. And so they have all this land. And then all of a sudden Johnson is like, you no longer have that land. Howard is the one that has to go tell the freedmen, we're taking away your land. And his hands are tied, right? Like he is part of the government. He's in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, but Johnson has ultimate control over what is going to happen. And that's the thing, like we were talking afterwards, like that's the thing that, with the country was robbed of when Lincoln was assassinated, is you really see it with Howard trying to do this work on the Freedmen's Bureau. Scott said running the Bureau was a no-win position. Yeah.
No, there was no chance.
It was not an easy job. And he finally is like, I think it's 1872, 1874. He's like, they get rid of the Bureau and Howard's like, I'm done with it. But by that point, unfortunately, because of stupid Fernando, well, I shouldn't say stupid Fernando Wood, but he's kind of a jerk. He has run Howard through the mud, not once, but twice. Saying that Howard was embezzling funds. He was like getting rich off the Freedmen's Bureau. And because of that, that is why we have the image that we do with the Freedmen's Bureau, is because of Fernando Wood. And for those who remember the Lincoln movie, Fernando Wood is that character that I love to hate. Lee Pace portrays him so well, but he gives these great orations in the Lincoln movie. But he's a guy that wanted to make New York City its own country and then secede.
King Abraham Africanus the First. Yeah, no, he's a good character, but we should talk about the 54th Mass today a little bit too, right?
Yeah, AQ mentions that another New Englander, swaggy Robert Gould Shaw. You called Barlow swaggy in the episode.
I called him swaggy in this episode, Andrea. That was for you. But everyone talks about Robert Gould Shaw. But the guy that people should really study is William Carney. If you really want to study the 54th Mass, you want to talk about the Battery Wagner. Study William Carney. He's buried over here in New Bedford that way. And we went to see his grave. I think it was last spring, or what the hell it was. But he's a guy who the Denzel character was loosely based on him.
Yeah.
This is a guy who he was basically, he fought, he carried the flag, and he was shot in both legs at the fort, and he's carrying the flag.
Yeah. Kind
of on his knees back. He gets the Medal of Honor for that. He's the first Black person to be awarded the Medal of Honor based on the date of his event.
Yeah.
When he got his physical medal, some other guys had gotten it, but his event was the first one. He retires to New Bedford, spends the rest of his life as a mailman.
Yeah.
In obscurity.
Fascinating story.
And so he's just one of those guys, didn't embellish himself, but he got the Medal of Honor. But there's a lot of guys like that though. When you study that, and Battery Wagner's a thing. If you've ever been at Battery Wagner, there's not much. It's just this big piece of sand. Now a lot of erosion's got to it.
Yeah.
But again, we talked a lot about Battery Wagner when we did the Robert Smalls episode.
Yep.
About
we did an episode on the 54th last year as well.
And we talk about the fact that Robert Smalls, because what he did, they were able to get that beachhead, which is now Parris Island, and help launch those attacks. So everything, it's funny how you could trace these things back to certain people and certain events, right? But anyway, we'll definitely talk about that. But
David, just getting back to the pre-Civil War, David mentions the book The Field of Blood being filled with incidents that are happening leading up to the Civil War, and we talked about that last night. There's the caning of Sumner, the James Jackson being a priest, but then you also have it's happening at West Point as well, with Howard getting hit over the head for his abolitionist views, which was very it was not a good thing to have at the time, and Howard was also ostracized after that.
That must have been a tough spot because you've got military.
He said his first year at West Point was terrible. He was ostracized.
He's there in 1850 to 1854, and right at the beginning of secession. And so, but you had that, you have that simmering cauldron of just hate. Yeah. And these are military guys. A lot of them come from privilege. A lot of Southern guys. We mentioned Custis Lee.
He's a bully there, isn't he?
Made Howard's life miserable. Just because what he was. And you had some other ones there too. S.D. Lee was another one. But again, that's how it was. And then he comes back to teach right before the war starts. William Hardy, who was the Greek god of everything at that school at the time, he's teaching infantry tactics. He wrote the book on infantry tactics. And then in January 61, after the election, after Sumter falls, he quits his commission and walks away, and all the students are just dumbfounded. And then it goes from there. So, but it's just fascinating, though. I mean, these people, it's almost like an incestuous world where they all kind of come into each other's lives at different points. We talk about Edmund Kirby Smith. You know, this is a guy who literally was on the train with Howard, when Howard was going from Maine to West Point. He was a teacher of mathematics, Edmund Kirby Smith, and he graduated, I think it was 1845, but he was a teacher there now, and he runs into Howard on the train, and they just get to know each other and their acquaintances. A couple of years later, Kirby Smith's firing on him at First Bull Run at Chinn Ridge. Yep. So it's just one of those things.
Well, it's like there's all these interconnections in the Civil War too, and there's so many stories that, you know, with Howard. I mean, we could have went on for hours about it. Like we could any episode about these guys. But like you have the story of his friendship with S.D. Lee. They were very close, and they fight against each other as a church, and they don't realize it till after, because Howard had no idea that S.D. Lee had been brought down. Now, S.D. Lee is not like, I mean, this is a guy that said, who was it? Tupelo was a victory when it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, again, if they're going to believe it, they might as well go for it.
I know, he's like, it was a victory. It's like, dude, no, it wasn't. But like, you have this friendship, and then after the war, S.D. Lee is looking for his pardon, and he writes Howard, and you know, something gets lost in translation. Howard's kind of like, I don't know if I can do that right now or not. And whatever he says really offends S.D. Lee, and S.D. Lee just ghosts him completely. And then years later, Howard is on a tour of Gettysburg, and he's with a mutual friend. And the mutual friend says, hey, have you talked to Stephen D. Lee lately? And Howard's like, no, we had a falling out, and I said something that really bothered him. And so this friend goes back to S.D. Lee and says, you need to make amends with this guy. Next thing you know, a letter arrives for Howard from S.D. Lee. And S.D. Lee says, you know what, this was a long time ago, and we need to repair, you know, just like we're repairing the country kind of thing, we need to repair the friendship. And they became good friends again. S.D. Lee unfortunately passes away 2 years later. But you know, that is one, like, you know, it's a very human story. And that's why I suspect it was S.D. Lee who might have hit him over the head. I don't know if it's between Custis and S.D. Lee. And I think it might have been S.D. Lee who totally ostracized him as well. But then they became friends again. It's just interesting that like the paths that Howard is like intertwining with people. And it happens all over the Civil War, right?
I mean, I understand it. You're S.D. Lee, especially your Custis Lee. You're a known name. In one way, shape, or form, and you're around compatriots who all kind of rally around the same that's bubbling cause of secession. If you're Custis Lee and your dad is the superintendent, or as you call it, the super Nintendo, that's a pretty good thing, right? To feel you can get away with anything. So my guess, it probably was Custis Lee, because Custis Lee was a dick to Howard. He was.
Oh yeah, he was a dick to everybody though, wasn't he?
I know, yeah, absolutely. And this is before the religion thing.
There's a really good picture of S.D. Lee, Custis Lee, and Jeb Stuart at West Point, which I found when I was doing research for this. I came across it. And Jeb Stuart is another one that is good friends with Howard. You found a cool story.
Well, Jeb Stuart's an interesting guy too, because you know they're at West Point, and a lot of if you read a lot of the sources, if it wasn't for Howard, Jeb doesn't even graduate. So from West Point, and I don't know what that means. Whether Howard was helping, I assume he was tutoring him, or who the hell knows. But Jeb was he was someone who Howard carried along and helped quite a bit. And this is from Southern sources. This is not from Bangor, Maine, right? This is real things. So you're friends with these guys, and then you're fighting these guys. I don't think people can realize what a dynamic that must be. You know, because it's obviously only happened once in American history, really. I mean, you get Revolutionary War, you had the Loyalists and stuff like that, but for the most part, you had people who were going to school with each other, or people who were militaries. We've talked about the famous Albert Sidney Johnson Winnie Boy story on Los Angeles, and how that must have been psychologically. And for Howard, secession happens. He wants to join. And so he writes the governor of Maine. The governor says nope.
Yeah.
And he ends up going to the to James Blaine, the Speaker of the House of Maine. He gets that third Maine. And if you're Howard, you're thinking, well, I want to do this, but I don't really feel like I have the confidence. I never really ran. I mean, you're a guy with limited experience. You're down in Florida. You're dealing with the Seminoles, but you're coming back now to run a regiment of people who you know, and you're going to be responsible for it. And we talked in the episode about that imposter syndrome, right? How a lot of these guys had it. Like I'm not sure this is for me. And he ends up going to John Reynolds, of all people, who he knew from West Point as well. Reynolds was there a few years before him. And he says, what do you think? And Reynolds is like, do it. Absolutely do it. Which is funny because Reynolds turns down the AOP job when he's asked to take it. He says no. So it's funny how he flips.
But I think that's because he's seen all the shit that's going on in the AOP too. Yeah,
it's obviously a lot different. But Reynolds was the confidant. So if you don't like Howard, you could thank John Reynolds for making this whole thing happen. Because I think if Reynolds told him don't do it, he probably wouldn't have.
Yeah. But didn't Howard trip on his way up to the platform?
He what?
Howard tripped on his way up to the platform.
He dropped his sword on his foot.
Oh, right.
And it affected him for the rest of his life. I don't know if he walked with a limp. Certainly could run pretty well, Mary, but he walked with a limp. And that happened. Actually, that happened here in Boston. Right. When that happened. So but that was a scoop with that. So but it's interesting to see how these guys, I'm always fascinated by how these guys all intertwine with each other. How the Hancock Harry Heath thing, the U.S. Grant Longstreet thing,
the Beauregard Robert Anderson connection.
Right. Yeah. There's so many cool connections because, speaking of Longstreet, when you're looking at the, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, at the end of the war was going on, Longstreet is going to try to meet with Edward Ord to try to come up with their own peace plan. Yeah, that he's going to, because he wants to meet with Grant because they're pals. Yeah, and Lincoln and Stanton say no. You're a soldier. You're not a politician. You keep fighting. Yeah. But they were trying to take advantage of those personal connections late in the war to end the whole thing. Yeah. And so that's so I always found that kind of interesting too, how politics gets involved and how the people in Washington, like they still do, get involved in too much, and that was a big issue.
MJ says we need an episode on Jeb. David said the episode will be released late, and then AQ said we need a swaggy episode with Barlow.
Barlow, that will definitely happen. Jeb's doing, we'll see too, but it's when you personify these people and you look at them as true actual people. It's so much more interesting. It just is. And most people here do that, but when you read certain things, you read certain people, it's clear that they don't. They take
they take the kind of they take the human aspect out of it. I mean, you read Howard's letters and you can see how much he misses his family during the war. Like when he was doing the March to the Sea in the Carolinas campaign, he has to write his wife numerous times saying, Sherman's not letting me leave. I can't, as much as I want to, I can't get home, and you'd think Sherman would have learned his lesson after McPherson to maybe give these guys a break if there was a break in like what they were doing to let them go home and see their families, but he didn't. Sherman was not good about giving leave for people to go home. And, that's and then you have the letters you talked about in the episode where Howard drew a picture of himself in one of his letters in 1861 so his kids would know what he looked like.
And that's the thing too. When you read look at his letters, and we, you really reached out to Lincoln Memorial University, and they sent us a bunch of stuff for this episode, some pictures and some documents that we were able to look at. And the letters he writes, especially the letters when he was down in Florida, back home, he had 3 kids at the time, and so he was drawing a picture of himself so his kids wouldn't forget what he looked like, and he could draw a little bit. I mean. Yeah, he probably not as good as you, obviously.
But you read that letter. He writes a letter the day after he gets his arm amputated to let his wife know he's coming home. It looks like a 3-year-old wrote it because
he writes with his left hand the day before, and by the time he got later on, he got pretty good at writing with the other hands.
Oh yeah. AQ said Sherman was a bit of a dick, just saying. Oh, he totally was.
Well, Sherman, what's funny about Sherman, like a lot of these guys, like Grant, like a lot of them, is if you were under him, you were good. And Sherman clearly liked Howard. He said he was his best general on the March to the Sea.
Yeah.
But as soon as Sherman found out that Howard got the superintendent gig at West Point in 1882, he was pissed off.
Yeah.
So I mean, he's one of those, stay in your lane, you're cool, but if you do something that I don't, that whatever. And so but they were all like that though. Grant especially was like that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You okay?
Yeah. All right. I choked it up.
Shanna said Lincoln and Stanton saying to separate politics from military. That's rich. It is.
There's so many ironies with that.
Stanton especially.
Because, Edward Ord is going to meet with Longstreet. This is around Petersburg here. This is getting pretty late in the war now. And Grant's like, Lee's like, okay, yeah, whatever, go see what happens. And they're trying to set up this thing. And Ord is going to go to Grant, and Grant's going to go to Washington and say, here's what they want to do. What do you think? And they go, nope. So they go back to fighting, and ends up leading to the Appomattox thing. But that just goes to show the ego in that with a lot of them too.
Exactly. And, the speaking of Sherman, Howard talks in his memoirs about when he moves to New York, that Slocum lives there too. And the three of them often went out together, usually to the theater. And he said that, Sherman always had Howard sit on his right and Slocum on his left, because they were the right and left wing commanders. And I thought that was really cool. Just how these three maintain this friendship. And it was in February of 1891 that Sherman passes away. But before that, he expressed his wishes to Howard and Slocum that they be the ones to plan his funeral. And Howard talks in his memoirs about, it was in at the internment in St. Louis that Joseph E. Johnston is there. And Howard talks about the story where Johnston was told to put on his hat, and Johnston's like, no, I'm not going to. And he passes away like 2 weeks later.
Yeah. That's always an interesting thing too, is how these guys were. They go from, loving each other to hating each other, to loving each other all over again. We talked a lot about, speaking of Maine, up at Chamberlain's house when John Brown Gordon's up there, and a lot of the people are up at the Chamberlain house, and how they're kind of just shooting the shit, probably shooting whiskey, smoking, just kind of hanging out. And I can't, every time I think of that story, I think of that table.
I know where the initials are all carved, where he got out that pocket knife and he just said, carve your initials in this table.
They all passed out a pocket knife, Chamberlain, Howard, Gordon, and they all signed the table.
Name are on the table.
And the table's lost to history. It's just gone. No one knows where it is. So somebody somewhere probably has a table in their garage with those signatures on it, carved in with a knife. Can you imagine how cool that would be?
So cool. Glow Jam says, sometimes individuals have an epiphany later in life through experience and personal grief that rattles the conscience to recognize their failures. Howard and Sickles may have had that in common. I think maybe that was their common ground. That, Sickles gets a lot of shit over Gettysburg, and he did back then as well. So maybe he and Howard were able to, they respected each other. Obviously, Sickles gives a speech at his 70th birthday party.
Yeah, we gotta find that.
I have the program for it. I've seen the program for it, but I want to find out if there's like newspaper article that talks about the speech. That
we're gonna have to reach out to Hessler. I know we were talking this morning about some other stuff, but we have to reach out to him and ask him about if he has anything on that birthday thing. Because can you imagine that's how that speech must have gone? Because you remember Sickles is the guy who went down to Atlanta, right?
Yeah.
No, was it Atlanta or New Orleans? I forget.
New Orleans with Longstreet, and they got drunk and helped each other back to the same hotel room.
And Sickles is in this Confederate veteran convention. And he's the balls. He stands up on his one leg on a table, on a chair. It might have been a table, but I think it might have been a chair. And he sings the Star Spangled Banner in front of all the Confederates.
Longstreet is there too.
I mean, that and Hancock going to the reunion of the 1st Minnesota are the two drop the mic ballerous moves post-war. Because can you imagine the balls it would take to do both of those? Hancock doubles down on it because he sits there and says, I'd do it again. I had no choice.
Yeah.
But that's how they were, though.
There was one story I found, Howard writes about in his memoirs, where Howard talks about how respectful the Confederate generals and the Confederate soldiers always were to him. After the war, that a lot of them really respected them. And Howard thought it was, Howard said, maybe this is because what we were trying to do for them. Maybe some of them did recognize what we were trying to do for them,
It's tough to say. I think there's that common bond that soldier code thing where they realize, we fought on other sides. We know your plight.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes to friendship too. And I mean, there is like, he mentions Claiborne a couple of times in his memoirs. Now, obviously, Howard never met Claiborne in person, but Claiborne had a reputation. And Howard talks about a little bit about that, about how, like, what a badass he was to go up against, especially at Missionary Ridge.
No, they all had their good and their bad days. And that's why it's tough to label somebody. You can sit there and say, yeah, Howard fell on his dick at Chancellorsville. There's no question about that. But he did March to the Sea. He had Ezra Church. And they all have their pluses and minuses. But history remembers them differently by the contemporaries versus the people now.
And I think it goes back to the way that these people are written about and who writes the histories. We were talking about that. You know, I think Ed Bars is great. He was such a great resource for the Civil War, but I do not agree with his opinion about Howard. But some people just fall into that. Well, if Ed thinks it must be true or whatever, right? And Stephen Sears, you run into that with him as well, with the way he treats McClellan. There's people that are like, you're almost like scared to question it because, like, well, it's Sears, he must be right, you know. But the narrative, thankfully, is starting to change about McClellan, and you know, maybe the narrative will start to change about Howard too. That, you know, that he's not as bad as what people say.
Well, I don't think people, you know, study Howard that much, because nothing against Howard, but McClellan was the big dog. He ran the big army there for a while. You know, I still think his biggest mistake was going against Lincoln, right? And the Lincoln people, I don't know if you know this, Mary, they're a little on the culty side.
Oh,
right? You may have learned that, but that's what happens. And so McClellan, if you really get into it, Tom Clements, he's a historian. He wrote a book on Lost Order 191, and he's somebody. If you really want a good idea of Lost Order number 191, listen to the episode first of all. But if you don't, check out Reed Clemens' book, because he debunks a lot of that Stephen Sears narrative of McClellan being slow and blah. And he was, to a point, but it tells a lot of what was going on at that time.
McClellan had his reasons.
And he also had the thing about it is this: he puts a timeline in that makes South Mountain battle could not have happened if Stephen Sears' timeline is correct. It just can't. And so he breaks that down. Unless he had a time machine or he ran as fast as Howard did, Mary, I don't think he's going to be able to do that. But he talks about the fact of what McClellan actually did when that order was found. And the pieces that were in play. And one guy who really doesn't get talked about a lot with 191 is Andrew Curtin, the governor of Pennsylvania, who's telling the government that there's 1 million Confederates in Virginia ready to attack Maryland. And that's where there's numbers. So now what do? You ask for more men, because if these guys got, however, 100, it wasn't 1 million, it was a couple 100,000. If they have that many, I need this many. So what does history say? McClellan didn't do anything because he kept wanting more men. They don't tell why.
Yeah, they don't say why.
And that's why it's fascinating. You know, McClellan has his issues, like they all do.
Yeah, they all do.
But I think if you're going to be true to the history, you have to really study the parts that maybe you haven't been taught before or don't really like.
Or that are conveniently left out. Like, well, Shanna said it's Alex Rossino and Gene Thorpe with their book, The Tale Untwisted, is the big one that came out this year that tells that story of debunking that. And MJ said, I always tell people, read as much as you can, which is what we do as well. Formulate your own opinions on the people and don't take one person's view as gold. And that's a lot of what, you know, has happened with Howard. It's happened with McClellan. It's happened with a lot of them. And unfortunately, and Sears does not like Howard either. He's very biased against Howard. Very unfair.
And nothing. I mean, Sears. Look, the good thing about history is its interpretation. It's not math. So the way person A sees something versus person B sees something, they can look at it from two different angles at the same subject and have different opinions. It doesn't mean one's right or one's wrong. It's just their opinion. And the problem is that I noticed this when years and years ago, I first started just studying history, was you tend to read one book on a subject, and that book tends to be your gospel, and you move on to the next subject. And whatever that first book taught you, it sticks with you. And then if you do this for a lot longer than you probably should be, you read other sources down the road, and you go, shit, what I've thought for the last 20 years might not be right. And then you got to soul search to yourself and study more. But the problem is people don't study this like people here on this chat do. And so when you go to a place like Brunswick, and you got some jackass giving you shit because he saw the movie Gettysburg and knew what happened in the movie, that's the reality of it. And that's why it's the people who really, there are certain people on this chat I associate with certain people. Obviously, Shannon with McClellan, MJ with Cushman and Hancock, AQ with Barlow,
Swaggy Barlow.
But you know what though? I've heard all of them also criticize those people.
Yep.
So they're not, I've even heard you criticize Howard once in a while.
Yeah, he doesn't have a good day at Chancellorsville. He's a guy.
You said as he got older, he wasn't as handsome as he was when he was younger.
Oh,
No, but what I'm saying is you have to be objective. You have to be true to the history. And I think more people are doing that now. And you're starting to see some of these alternative books come out, like the McClellan book. Yeah. Right. Which I think is good. I think it's refreshing.
No, I think it's good to question the history that has been written and look at what their sources are. What are they using for that opinion? The one I referenced in the episode was the letter that Buford wrote in July the 1st. There are people that say that letter was written and sent to Meade at 3:30 in the afternoon, long after Howard had been there. You read the letter, and my opinion is he wrote that letter soon after Reynolds was killed, but before he knew Howard was on the field. Because it makes no sense that he would say that, basically say everything's in chaos when Howard directs him where to go. I don't think Buford would have done that at all.
Yeah, and those are the $1 million questions. I mean, what time did Buford write that letter? We were talking to Chris White in the Mine a couple of weeks ago about this. I was bringing this up to him because he's somebody who was definitely on the anti-Howard camp, no question about that. But that's the thing is we talk about the letter, and that's the thing because when that letter was written, dictates everything. It really does. If he wrote that letter that night, that's a real indictment of Howard. Yeah, but if he writes it around 11 o'clock in the morning, back when Dan Skelly is leading him up the stairs at the Fahnestock house, well, that makes sense. Because no one seems to be in control. Reynolds is dead. They don't know, is it Doubleday in charge? Is it where the hell Slocum? He should be here. That's the thing is there's no one, we don't know who, this is in real time. This is not looking back 160 years ago.
That's why I don't think Buford would have written that letter after Howard was there, because Howard directs him where to go. And he establishes that kind of the organization that they need. Yes, it's still very chaotic. And the other thing we talked about too is that, Howard is described as being very frazzled at one point. I would be frazzled too if I found out the commander's dead. I'm 32 years old and now in charge of the entire field. I've had this shit happen to me in my corps at Chancellorsville, and they don't, and I don't have a great reputation. I might be a bit frazzled too in seeing what's going on. I think he was allowed to have that moment where he was in a bit of a tizzy. Hancock gets there, and as you said, you raise a good point. Hancock's very calm, but Hancock is also just coming onto the field, not having been in the situation Howard has been. So it's
a tough spot. It's a tough spot. Howard and Hancock, they're different. That X factor that Hancock had, Howard didn't have. Right. Yeah. That you can understand that. Right. But at the same time, you're right. Hancock's going to get there. He's going to see the defenses set up, and they're going to see more people coming in. He's going to be calm. And like anything else, think of your regular work day. You're at the DQ when the manager at your shop there is freaking out, right? Because the blizzard machines isn't cold enough. Then you're going to get nervous. But if your boss is calm and cool in the face of chaos, it's going to be cool. That's why the statue has his hand out. Yeah. If you look close, you could see McDonald's back. Just saying, right? But the reality is that is the truth though. And so he certainly was somebody who was wise enough to realize that that Cemetery Hill was the focal point. It certainly was. But again, the Battle of Gettysburg never should have happened there anyway. That's the funniest part about it.
We talked about that in the episode, that there's 3 people that know what was said at Moritz Tavern.
Right. And that's the thing was whatever the hell happened at Moritz Tavern, that's the Holy Grail. Yeah. And Charles Howard, Oliver Otis Howard, John Reynolds. I'm not sure if Captain Dickinson was still there at the meeting. He might have just left when he dropped the Pipe Creek Planoff.
Buford knew, even though he wasn't there.
But to be a fly in the wall. And they were there for a long time. And the only thing Howard said about it is when he left, Reynolds seemed very, very depressed. So I think for whatever reason, they knew they knew the battle was going to be the next day. But at the end of the day, whatever that they decided to do, they decided to do it. That might have been a YOLO moment.
I think it was basically Reynolds is like, we are going to fight here tomorrow. I've already told Buford that. So I need you at some point. I'm going to call you up here, and there is going to be a battle. And
well, Doubleday said when Reynolds was killed, and Doubleday doesn't get enough credit for Gettysburg, by the way. He should get a lot, especially on July 1st. He deserves a lot of credit. But he says that it was his understanding that Reynolds wanted to fight street to street and defend the town, which went against everything that the orders had.
Yeah.
But that's what they went with. So that Moritz Tavern meeting, did Reynolds tell Howard, we're going into town, we're going to defend this town and fight in the town? I mean, it sounds like he probably did. But again, that goes against everything Meade had wanted.
But maybe that's why Howard was the way he was, and even like Slocum and Sickles are like, when they get the orders to come up, they're like, what the hell? Because they weren't at that meeting, and that's why, but Slocum is, and we were talking about this, is like, they're laid out in such a way. So it's Reynolds with the First Corps, and he's leading that wing. And then there's Howard, and then there's Sickles. And then you have the next ones, which is Slocum, and they come up in that order to Gettysburg. And when Sickles gets the order to come up, he's like, okay, like, I didn't know this is what we were doing, but all right. But I think like, the one thing we mentioned in the episode too, was that, the people at that meeting, 2 of them are dead. Reynolds the next day, Buford by December. Howard never, ever reads a word of what was said.
I mean, he doesn't. And I think the problem with old Otis there was he had the perception, not just from his men, but by the Army, the Chancellorsville ghost haunted them, and it did. And so when you look at Charles Wainwright, when he's setting up the guns with Ricketts Battery, Weidrick's Battery up there in East Cemetery Hill, he tells the cannoneers, the artillery guys, fight here until the death, because there's a real good chance that these infantry are going to run.
Yeah.
Right. Now, Von Gils's guys did. They did. Right. They did. But Shizanovsky's guys didn't. They came up with Carroll to help. But that's the perception they had at the time. And Howard gets unfairly pissed all over for Gettysburg for the first day, because he wasn't even in charge of the 11th Corps the first day. And it was Schurz. And this is not an indictment of Schurz. Schurz the best he could. If you read Jim Poole's book, you realize that maybe what Barlow did, what the rest of them did, what Adelbar Ames did, that maybe it was not this perception, they just turned and took off. Now, the one thing you can blame Schurz for, which I've heard attributed to Howard, was he didn't give them a guide to where to go. They all were running through the town willy-nilly, kind of like you at 2:00 in the morning in town. I don't know where the hell you're going, stumbling the streets of Gettysburg. But what happens is it ends up with a lot of guys getting caught, guys like Schimmelfennig, right? Yeah. But again, I'm not sure how that's really anybody's fault, but I've heard that. Yeah. We were on the Addressing Gettysburg show that time. That guy called in and asked us that question, remember? Yep. Yeah. So that's the reality. That's what happens. Yeah.
I mean, you study these people, and some of them, and I mean, Shannon will know this from studying McClellan. We talked to Hessler about this. You often have to go on kind of the defensive with them because people have this perception. It's usually negative. And you get questioned, like, well, why do you study him? It's like, well, why does it matter? And Tony makes a good point. The ghost of Chancellorsville haunted Sickles too. And that's not what Sickles saw at Hazel Grove. It's what happened to Howard, because Sickles recognized that, oh shit, what happened to Howard could happen to me. And that's why he does what he does at the Peach Orchard. It's nothing to do with Hazel Grove.
Well, right. And Hazel Grove people assume, he had the high ground at Hazel Grove. He left, and then he got pounded. And then he didn't want to lose the Peach Orchard. On a black and white, it all computes, right? Yeah. But the problem was, and this is how you can tell if somebody believes or does not believe the Charles Payne map, right? Mm-hmm. Because if the map is true, and speaking of Hessler, this is where we had this debate about this. Yeah. We don't really agree with him on this, but if you believe the Payne map, the 5th or the 6th Corps was supposed to be on Sickles' left, and that left was supposed to take place right at the Peach Orchard. So if that's where he's supposed to be, then his position makes a lot more sense than where he actually was.
Yeah.
But again, Sickles and Howard are kind of symbiotic souls with a lot of things.
Yeah.
Because speaking of Sickles, what he did, I mean, he's told by Meade to watch that Union left flank, right? And he's ordered by Howard to come to Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And this is a guy with no real military experience. I mean, he's, his military business was monkey business, right? That was about it, right?
Yeah.
What does he do? He does both. He leaves half of his corps there and brings the other half up. And I mean, there's stories about how he was clogging the roads, he was taking too much time, and Meade was getting all pissed. There's a lot of stuff about that. But when you look at what these guys did in real time, one of the stupidest things you can hear anybody say was that Sickles was stupid, because he absolutely was. He was a genius. He was brilliant. Yeah. But it's funny how perception versus reality, and it's fun because you have your thing with Howard. I like Howard too. You're the Howard guru here, but he's somebody who, when you study the details of it, even Chancellorsville. Now the thing about Chancellorsville, and this is where the he said she said things, is those two messages, right? Yeah. So he's sleeping in his tent, kind of like Chamberlain,
before
when Buster comes in.
Oh yeah.
Wake up, darling. That whole thing. But the two messages are, for one, make sure you keep a strong reserve. And then the second message is watch your right, because we think they're moving to the right. Okay, fine. But Howard gets the first one, but he denies getting the second one. Yeah. And Sure says he gave it to Howard, and Howard says he didn't see it. So who the hell knows? But the one thing that Hooker contradicts himself on, the first message is keep a strong reserve. What does Hooker do? He takes Barlow's division from him. Yeah. And assigns him with Sickles. Yeah. So now he's down in division. And you got 30,000 NASCAR fans coming on you, hitting your flank, right? And you're left with really Von Gilsum and Schurz, who tries to defend that point. But I mean, if you're going to be told to keep a strong reserve, why do you take the reserve away and then blame Howard for not having enough men?
And then after the war, Hooker says, I knew Jackson was coming. No, you didn't.
But that's the thing, and that's what gets you is after Chancellorsville, everybody was in CYA mode, especially Hooker, because Hooker, he didn't know it, but he was about to get his ass fired. Yeah, he was, and they were looking to get rid of his ass pretty quickly, and they used the Harper's Ferry garrison as an excuse to get rid of him. Yeah. But I mean, you have a situation where you have the opportunity to fight and push Lee, and you pee down your leg and you stop. Even he says Joe Hooker lost confidence in Joe Hooker. Yeah. And you set up that defensive line. You leave your right flank in the friggin' in the air, right? And so what ultimately happens is you get beat, and so you need a scapegoat. And Howard's the easy guy.
Yeah. And he's a scapegoat. Hooker uses him as a scapegoat for the rest of his life.
He's got German soldiers who nobody likes. Mm-hmm. It's an easy target. So and we've said this a million times. You could have put any army in the world in that spot, and Jackson was going to beat him. He just had the numbers. But at the same time, he's a target. And that stigma, especially the Northern press, stays with Howard for the rest of his career.
Yep, it does. Yeah. And that doesn't help that things like Fernando Wood with the Freedmen's Bureau happen and all that. But, the other thing, there was one story I didn't talk about. And it goes back to the Grand Review with Sherman coming up to him the day before the Grand Review in May of 1865. And he says, I want Logan to march with the Army of Tennessee and be their commander for the Grand Review. Yeah. And Howard says, I was the one that took those men after McPherson. I did all that. They were on the march to the sea with me. I was their commander. And Sherman, it's kind of brilliant what Sherman says to him. And he's like, Howard, you're a Christian. You're not going to mind doing this, making this sacrifice. And Howard's like, well, if you put it that way, then I guess I have no choice. Yeah. And that's why Howard marches up with Sherman during the Grand Review, and Blackjack Logan marches with the Army of the Tennessee, which is and that just Sherman just uses the whole, you're a Christian, make the sacrifice. Basically, this is how it's going to be, and you can't argue with me over it.
No, I mean, we've talked about this before. I mean, part of me thinks a lot of having Slocum and having Howard on his march because he knew he could control both of them. Yeah. And he also knew Howard was the adult in the room, including himself. He was the one. Because
people have said to me, well, like, Blackjack should have been in charge. He knew the men better, blah, blah, blah. And I say to them, could you imagine Blackjack at Columbia? It would have
it would have been bad. It would have been bad. But
I mean, I love Blackjack Logan. But he is not the man that you want in charge when stuff is burning and soldiers are getting
right. And by then, the 11th Corps, it's been dispersed. I mean, the first division goes on a Schimmelfennig to Charleston. He ultimately ends up taking Charleston. Second and third, Pigman. The second and third division are going to go west. But I mean, when you look at Howard, though, I mean, by all accounts, he should have got the 3rd Corps instead of Sickles. He outranked him, and he complained and bitched about it. And then he got the 11th Corps soon later when Franz Sigel got the old heave-ho. And that's a tough spot for him because now you're a Bible-thumping Maine guy who doesn't speak German going up. And it wasn't all Germans. It wasn't, but there was a lot of them.
It was predominantly.
And these are dudes who like beer. They like to have a good time. They like to write bugle calls. That whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And so they have a lot of fun, but at the same time, they hate the idea that Vladimir Shizhanovsky, Carl Schurz, Schimmelfennig, all these guys, von Gilsup, are not in the big chair. They got this religious guy, and Howard, by all accounts, the thing about Howard though is I don't think he didn't like the Germans. I just think he didn't know them, but he was very fond of the Jewish soldiers in that. And that's the thing. People talk a lot about his relationship with black soldiers and stuff later on. He was very progressive with Jewish soldiers. And there were a lot of Jewish soldiers in the 11th Corps who liked him because they were hated too, like the Irish, like a lot of them.
Yeah.
And like I said before, 1 in every 4 Union soldiers in the Civil War was from somewhere else. I don't know if you know this, Mary, but people in this country don't tend to like foreigners. They never really have. I don't know if you've heard, discovered it since you've been here, but that's the reality. But Howard did kind of ingrace himself to that part of that corps, but they still didn't trust him. They didn't like him.
No. Well, I mean, it's the Bible thing too. And, AQ says, what you say, Howard disliked German soldiers too. I thought only Barlow was the German. Barlow hated them. And David, or AQ mentions Logan is an interesting study. I would love to do an episode of Blackjack Logan. He's very fascinating. And then David said, Blackjack would have been in charge. That would have been a whole lot of YOLO right there.
well, Blackjack, he's a military hero. He's got Logan's Circle by DuPont, Washington. He's a guy who did a lot of things as well.
He's like Sickles. He's a very good political general. But then you have someone like Franz Sigel, who's a terrible political general. And David mentions, and we've talked about this in the podcast before, the Germans did pretty well in Missouri at the start of the war. And that's because Franz Sigel is the one that kind of rallies them all together and all that. And a lot of these Germans had fought in the revolutions in, I think it's 1848.
Right, 1848, the Prussian one, yeah.
Yeah, Carl Schurz is part of it. I think von Gilsa, Shizhanovsky, Schimmelfennig, I think even Sigel, but not as much.
But I think
has a lot of experience with it.
The problem that Howard ran into was he was replacing a guy who was popular.
Yeah, even though he sucked.
And right, but again, he was one of them. If they'd have put Carl Schurz in charge, if they'd have put Sickles, if they'd have put Howard in charge of the 3rd and Schurz in charge of the 11th, how history might have been a little bit different. Can you imagine Sickles in the 3rd Corps? Howard in the 3rd Corps. He would have gone to the Peach Orchard, would have kept going.
Longstreet would have been like, "Where's that guy going?"
California's the place you ought to be. Set up the Corps, they moved to Beverly. That's probably what they would have done. But the reality was how history changes because of decisions that are made. Yeah. So you have Sickles who takes charge of the 3rd Corps, and he got his corps right to Gettysburg, but he had his positives too. He certainly did. We both were definitely team Sickles here.
Yeah.
But Howard, he took a tough spot. What if Sickles got the 11th? Can you friggin' imagine that? Just you want to play the what if game. Now he would have drank beer with the fellas. He probably would have.
That would have been a party regiment. That
would have been different. But he would have probably had the XXX Corps. He would have changed to the 30th Corps probably. Yes, but that's how history gets you.
Like there's these little things that could have happened. We've talked before. What if Kearney had lived?
Yeah, no.
Like, would he have been in command at some point? He might have been. Which corps would he have been in charge of? Oh, have a good day, AQ. She said,
see you, AQ. See you, Swaggy. But we did talk a lot about Howard, the post-war stuff, and his post-war stuff is very fascinating. We talked Freeman's Bureau. We did talk a little bit about the Indian Wars. We didn't talk. We're probably going to do a separate episode on the Indian Wars because there's way more to it, and we don't want the episode to be 3 hours long. So, I mean, he's going to go out to Arizona and he's going to sign that with Cochise, with the Apaches, and he's going to do that. And then a couple years later, he's going to go up to what is Washington State now and deal with the Nez Perce with Chief Joseph.
Non-treaty,
and that whole story is fascinating because depending on who you read, you would think Howard would have slaughtered 1 million Indians because that's just the way some of these people talk about it. But really, it's an interesting study. For one, Chief Joseph wasn't the primary military guy anyway.
No, he
was a guy. I can't pronounce his name, but it starts with T and has 25 letters.
Yeah.
Right.
To some.
Yeah. But Joseph ultimately ended up, basically stopped fighting. But again, you had a situation where they had a bunch of land.
Yeah.
Like, I think it was like 750,000 acres or something like that. Yeah. And they reduced them down to like 75,000 acres and just told them to get GTFO. And so they didn't like that too much. And so they ended up kind of moving out. And then Howard was charged to go chase them down and then make treaty with them. But it's kind of an ugly stain, but in a way. But his military career kind of began and ended with the Seminoles and the Nez Perce, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of a bookend type thing. But it's an interesting study when you talk about it. And somehow they got those two together years later for a picture.
Yeah, I found that picture. I was like, oh, like,
and they're both sitting down next to each other,
and they look so angry.
Exactly how you'd expect them to be. If you Google Alvaro Otis Howard and Chief Joseph and hit images, you'll see the picture.
Yeah, and they're just kind of pulling away from, they're pulling away from each other, they're kind of each to the side, But how they got them to do that picture, that was really cool.
No, it certainly was, and there's a lot of that. And Joseph had that famous quote, "I will fight no more, never." They had it at that point. But when he finally does retire to Burlington, Vermont. Yeah, which we were supposed to go next weekend, and the plans screwed up because the state is floating away.
Well, I've said to people, I'm like, people are like, "Why are you going to Burlington?" I'm like, "Well, my favorite general's buried there," and I said, "He's been there since 1909. I don't think he's gonna be going anywhere anytime soon."
No. So we had plans to go to Vermont next weekend, and they have a little flooding issue in the state, and even the Ben and Jerry's factory is floating in the water right now. So we have to wait on that one. So unfortunately, we'll have to wait. But he ends up going out there. His son Guy is building he's an engineer. He's building Fort Ethan Allen in Burlington, and he also built a house for his parents. And so he, at this point, Howard is he's very ingrained in a Lincoln Memorial University.
Yeah.
And so it was 1894.
1897.
Right, in 1897.
In 1890, in the mid 1890s, he goes out to Chattanooga to tour the battlefields. He's actually going out there with a group to select a place for a memorial out there. I'm suspecting it's maybe for the battles of Missionary Ridge that he was involved in, or perhaps Wauhatchie. And he ends up stopping over in Harrogate, Tennessee, where there was this resort being built by a British guy. Anyway, he had this conversation with Abraham Lincoln in 1863. And Lincoln always said, I want you to do something for the people of the Cumberland region, because they've been loyal to us in the Civil War. And Howard never forgot that. And so Howard's big thing was educating people. Be you an African American or, someone in Appalachia that is poor, he believed in educating people. And he told, his children all had great educations. I think they all went to college, which is really cool. So they did make this decision to establish what will become Lincoln Memorial University. And for the rest of his life, Howard will constantly write people for funding for that school. And he puts he said it was a labor of love. And one of the last letters he writes on October 26, 1909, hours before he passes away, is to someone asking for funds for Lincoln Memorial University. So it was clearly something that was very, very important to him. And they have an Oliver Otis Howard collection there too. They have the one thing that I've requested from them is basically kind of the sermon from Howard's funeral, as well as an article from a newspaper that talks about how Lizzie Howard, his wife, she falls into poverty after Howard dies, and she's got to go and ask for a pension and everything else. And I think they agree to give her $100 a month. But she passes away a year and a half after Howard in 1911.
Yeah, and they had we have 8 kids, 9 kids. Yeah, but seven, and they
Three
all
of them
lived,
born after the Civil War, and
right.
they
But
all lived to adulthood.
which is fascinating for that era.
Yeah.
But Howard was a true family guy. He was very, all the stuff that he talked about was true. He wasn't the type of guy to get himself in any trouble, any shenanigans.
He loved, you know what I found out? He loved dogs.
Yeah, he was a big dog guy.
Yeah, he talks about this in the book he wrote about his experiences with the natives. He goes back to his childhood to kind of set things up for how he first learned about the natives and how that, you know, his point of view eventually changed. And I read that quote in the episode where it was like Howard had this, he admitted to having bias against them and thinking they were, you know, not great people. But then he's like, whoa, the white people are not being very good here either. You know, it's like, and he said, savagery is savagery, no matter who you are. And he was like, we can't condone this. And that's why he, you know, he changed his opinion of the Native Americans, which again shows the progressive side of it. Now he still has the biases of his time though, as well.
He does.
He's not like we are today. But yeah, he loved dogs. He talks about this one dog that he was always with when he was a kid. And he said at night, the dog would like lay out in front of the fire, and Howard would get on his grandfather's lap and try and take his glasses and all this other stuff. But then in 1861, when he writes a letter home, he writes a letter to his daughter, Grace, and says, oh, and say hi to Orestes for me. Orestes was the family dog. Mm-hmm. And then, and I think he had a dog throughout his entire life. There's a picture I found with him when he's older, and there's a dog there. And then he's staying at a house in Bentonville. It's near and he wrote this letter on, I think it's April 14th or April 15th. And he still doesn't obviously, you know, or no, it was April 17th. He doesn't know about the Lincoln being assassinated, but he's writing his son and saying, I don't know when we're coming home. And he draws a picture of a dog and he says, there's a dog staying here.
Yeah. No, he was think of the biggest dog lover, you know, that was
Howard. Yeah.
That's the reality. Those are the cool stories you learn as you really study them and you get to know them as people.
Yeah.
Right.
I love that he called his dog Orestes.
Yeah, no, yeah. And it's you look at those letters he drew, he would draw pictures, he would do everything. Yeah. He's just such a fascinating guy. But you know, he was a guy, he's back in Burlington, and you know, when he dies, he's working. The day he died, he worked.
Yeah.
He had a house over there on Summit Street in Burlington, and he would walk down College Road, if you know Burlington, and he would go to his office where he did his LMU work, and he would walk back, and he always walked. And that day he died, he wasn't feeling well. It was the only day he ever got a ride home.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he hitchhiked with one arm. I don't know. Maybe he did. But he got a ride back, and he literally walked in the front door, went up to bed, and died. Yeah. That was it.
Yeah. And the one thing that I didn't mention in the episode, and I feel terrible I didn't, is that when Howard passes away on October the 26th, 1909, he is the last Union general that commanded an army to die.
Yep, so he was the
last army. So someone that commanded an army. So you think Sherman is gone, Grant is gone, General Thomas is gone, obviously McPherson. All these guys that commanded an army in the Union are dead. And Howard held that title for quite a while. I think
he did, but you know what? It's best to my knowledge, he never embellished that. He never talked about it.
It said it on his if his lecture series. It does say it, but he doesn't mention it in his memoirs at all. I tried to find it, but I don't think he really talks about it much. But that that got me thinking, how does he feel when that one before him dies and he realizes it's just me? And
when
you are now the last one.
You're the last one. And and he ends up going out to London, Ontario. Right before he dies, probably caught something up there, stupid Canadians. But he ended up going out there not far from where we were a few weeks ago.
Yep, his last public appearance in London,
Ontario, and he's going to come back. But no, he's someone who for whatever reason he gets focused. They focus on the negative, and not to be an apologist, because he does screw up. And he does.
Yeah.
And I think he's somebody, especially at the beginning, from his third Maine days. He was flying by the seat of his pants in a lot of ways.
I mean, like many of them were. He doesn't have a great day at Bull Run at all. But Sherman too also, like, Sherman had to get out basically a textbook and read, how do I get my guys in order? I've never had to do this before.
Yeah, but Howard, I mean, he wasn't growing up as a kid dreaming of the day of being in the Army. This is a guy who wanted to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And it was his uncle, after about to graduate Bowdoin, when he was graduating, he said, you should go to West Point. And he decided to do it. He says it was one of the big turning points of his life.
Yeah.
But at that point, he wasn't a military guy.
No.
And he relies on, mentioned before, he relies on Edmund Kirby Smith to kind of teach him how to not be stupid and how to not get in trouble with demerits and everything at West Point.
Yeah.
And so he was that guy who had the job, but always felt that maybe there was someone better.
Yeah.
And he was reminded of it. And especially with Heintzelman, all of them, it seemed like whatever he did wasn't enough in his own mind. And he had his mistakes. He's no question he did.
Oh yeah. And but there's a lot of the guys he admires. Like, one of the lectures he gave after the war was about Grant. There was one about the March to the Sea, but there was also one about Lincoln, but also George Henry Thomas was another one he really admired quite a bit. And I mean, anybody that hasn't read it, Howard's memoirs I put them up there with Grant and Sherman's. They're another perspective. Mm-hmm. He's funny. Like, he's very self-deprecating.
He's got a very New England dry sense of humor to him. And it comes across as a little bit aloof or sarcastic. But the fascinating thing about Howard is he's the one guy I wish, kind of like Thomas too, but especially Howard, you wish he named names.
Yeah, I'd love to know who hit him at West Point. I'd love to know who wrote that letter after Gettysburg telling him, or after Chancellorsville, to get rid of the 11th Corps, to leave the 11th Corps. I think it was Meade that wrote it.
He alludes to a lot of things, and if they just knew who he was talking about, it could fill in a lot of gaps. I wish he would have written something substantial about Moritz Tavern, because if there was real legit intel about that meeting, it could solve a lot of questions, like why Buford was there, why Reynolds fought the way he did, why Meade didn't pull everybody back anyway, why he committed to fight at Gettysburg. There's so many things that were missing.
Yeah.
That maybe it was a little more organized than we thought for that left wing when they went into Gettysburg. Yeah. I don't know.
But I think Howard does it out of respect, to not throw people under the bus.
Well, that's why he does the whole, well, you know who you are type thing.
Yeah.
You wish you'd be a little more like Charles Wainwright or Abner Small, who you would just point blank say, this guy sucks.
Who knows? Right? Maybe I'll discover it when I'm doing research for the book. Like that,
Maybe the secret is in those drawings, Mary. Maybe it's kind of like
he's writing code.
He's writing code.
His code.
Maybe there's some sort of secret code. He wasn't a Freemason though, but we don't really exist anyway. But there was some sort of code. Who knows? But he's interesting. But there are people. But the problem with a guy like a Howard, or even for Sickles for that matter, because they're a lot alike and a lot. They're very different, but they're also very alike. Was history grabbed them and painted them with a broad brush. Ed Bars did a lot of damage to Howard.
Yeah.
And a lot of his disciples from there have kind of gone and have kind of taken the ball and run with it a little bit.
And you know what? It's okay to say that Ed Bars might have not been correct in that opinion. Like, I mean, it's his opinion, but maybe it's not, maybe taking, fresh look at it. It's not to disrespect Ed Bars to say, I don't agree with him on that. I mean, I love Ed Bars. He's great, but I don't agree with him about Howard, just like I don't agree with Stephen Sears.
No, but he's funny. He had that quote where he felt like he wasn't feeling well at the Howard statue and said, please don't let my last sight on earth be all of Otis Howard statue. Things he had little things that were fun. Yeah. And he's been gone about 3 or 4 years now. It's unbelievable. But
Frank said, if only Howard left a will to reveal all those names. Could you imagine if Howard left a letter to be opened after I die and he calls all these people out?
Like a time capsule?
Yeah, or if he's like, Custis Lee, F you for what you did to me at West Point.
No, but he does. There's enough sources to talk about the West Point stuff. But it was definitely fascinating. He never revealed who's the one who beat the hell out of him there.
No,
because Howard would have lied to his superintendent, Robert E. Lee, about that. He would have lied to him.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so it kind of to show even though he was a neophyte as far as being a cadet goes, he still had those values of not like I'm not ratting up. So which I totally would have. Fuck that. Kidding me?
It was Custis Lee.
I would have blamed everybody.
But the other one too that we don't know about, and I just mentioned this a few minutes ago, but there's a letter written to Howard after Chancellorsville by, all he says, it's a very high-ranking officer in the Army of Potomac. And this officer tells him, get rid of the 11th Corps because those guys will always run. And Howard does not name names. I suspect it was Meade and maybe Reynolds.
It was either Meade or Reynolds. We thought it was Meade, but he had a little bit of a history with Reynolds, but not too much. But
it could have been Sickles as well.
What was important is that it was somebody.
It was
somebody told him. So so it did happen. It's whether or not it was who knows. But I mean, what's good about Howard is that he was loyal, but also that's what's bad about Howard.
Yeah.
Because it just being the whole gossipy type of mentality, it would have been cool to read if he had a memoirs, like a Longstreet memoirs where he just whipped out his OO and peed all over everybody.
That's what Sherman does.
I know he does. And
but the other one, the other story too that we didn't get to talk about is when he's in Columbia and he like basically loses his mind on that woman, and then she comes in and everybody thinks it's either Jefferson C. Davis or Blackjack, and then she's like, no, it's Howard.
No, Howard, if you read his stuff, his memoirs, he was the guy who said the wrong thing at the wrong time, especially to women. We talked about Elizabeth Thorne in Gettysburg when he tells her, you should probably get the hell out of here. You should take your valuables. But then he goes, you probably think everything here is valuable. And she glares at him. Probably imagines burying his body on that hill with those other guys. But then that woman in Bentonville,
or Columbia, right?
Or Columbia, when she complains that a Union general was mean to her, and of course they all look at Blackjack, right?
Yeah, or Jeff C.
And they
Davis.
go, "Oh, Jeff C. Davis," and she goes, "No, it was the one-armed man." Can you imagine when she left the room how much they must have laughed at that point? But again, he had a dry wit sense of humor that got him in trouble sometimes.
Well, and that was the one thing too that people said they liked about him, that despite the religion, he still could, he was the type of guy that would be really quiet, but then someone would say something and then he would just drop this joke and people would laugh. Like, he had this sense of humor on him. But yeah, he talks about that story about how the woman comes in and Sherman's like, well, we'll deal with this man. We'll get him court-martialed or whatever. And then she's like, it's Howard. And you could just imagine Howard's sinking down in his chair, oh shit.
I mean, Howard was literally the Ned Flanders of that army.
Oh yeah.
So just picture, Sherman must have been like, oh God, Howard, seriously. And he's probably like, it is what it is,
Yeah. Well, there's that, he writes too about the one conversation between Kilpatrick and Sherman, and Howard's there for it. And Kilpatrick says to Sherman, well, how do you want me to let you know I've gotten to where you want me to be? And Sherman just says to him, burn a bridge or something.
Just burn something. Just fire something up, just burn something. But no, he's an interesting fella.
Yeah. Miranda said, would Howard have been named Custis Lee at West Point with R.E. Lee as superintendent? No, that's probably why he didn't.
No, we weren't saying at the time, but later he didn't say who it was.
He still didn't later say.
I mean,
he's writing this years later. He
could have easily dropped dime later and said, here's what happened. Because that article that came out wasn't until 1910.
Yeah.
The year after he died, a newspaper article came out with the story of what really happened to Howard. And it's by no happenstance it's after he dies. So maybe it was one of those, I've got some stories to tell after I die, please tell them situation. But no, he was never going to name Custis if it was Custis. And again, we don't know it was Custis, but let's say it was.
I suspect it was either Custis or S.T. Lee.
The one it was Jeb, because him and Jeb were surprisingly very, very close at West Point.
Yeah.
And so, if
Howard was older than all of them too. He was 20 years old when he started at West Point. So
he'd already gone to college. He was basically going for his master's degree.
Yeah.
If you think about it, he already went to Bowdoin, but he ends up never saying who it was, at least not directly. But I mean, if it was Custis, it'd be fun. I mean, it's certainly, it wouldn't surprise me. either SD Lee or Custis is my guy. But again, this is assuming it's a famous guy. This could have been some random cadet guy who's been lost to history too. But whoever it was, I mean, Howard doesn't spill it. He doesn't, and he never does.
No. Frank said, well, if you watch The Simpsons, you know Flanders has rock hard abs. So that was obviously why the writer's based on.
Right? It all makes sense now.
You can just see Howard when he gets orders. Oakley Dokley.
From now on, he's Oakley Dokley Howard.
Oakley Dokley.
You know.
Imagine getting Oakley Dokley.
Oakley Dokley, but he was interesting fellow to say the least, but it's pretty cool.
Oh yeah, I was glad we finally got to talk about him. But like I said, and his memoirs are available online. So is his book that he wrote about his experiences with the natives, which is really interesting reading. Bowdoin College, Howard University, and LMU all have great Howard collections. Some of them are not all digitized, but if you're ever looking for anything for research from LMU, they are so good about responding. I've been working with Rachel, and she's so nice. She's like, yeah, I can get this stuff for you. You just have to fill out this form. Bowdoin Colleges is digitized, so you can go on there and you can see the pictures. They have a great picture collection of Howard. And I'm still looking for the graduation picture, though. That's the one we're looking for.
Have you reached out to Bowdoin about that picture?
I need to.
There's a picture of Oliver Otis Howard in his graduate. He's an older guy at this point. He goes back. He's kind of like the faculty. He's sitting there with the graduation. Yeah. And the one picture that we found, he's cut off. But it's him. But it's cut off. We just want to see if we get the full picture. We were Bowdoin last year, walking around checking that stuff out. But it's limited. We were just there for a couple of days or two.
Yeah, so and I had emailed them, and they're like, our collection's digitized. You don't need to come and see it. Paul said Flanders is obviously based off Howard. That's why Flanders opens the left-handed store because of the missing right arm.
Wouldn't that be amazing if the people who did The Simpsons
well, Conan O'Brien was one of the writers. So yeah, he's big into the Civil War.
If we uncovered the fact that Flanders was supposed to be Howard, how funny that would be. I mean, there's no way in hell it is, but it'd be pretty funny.
I can't get the Oakley Dokley.
I mean, he was what he was, but this is a great time. I mentioned before, this is also the anniversary of Wagner, so everybody's got to watch Glory now.
160th of Wagner, which is Glory is, again, it's not 100% historically accurate, but
it's actually not very accurate.
No, but it's entertaining. It's like all the people shitting all over the Napoleon trailer this week, and I'm like, I just want to go see that movie. I know nothing about Napoleon. I don't care. It's okay if a movie is a historical movie, and every historical movie takes liberties. Something, and that's just the reality. But there are certain things about that movie that, again, the scene. I mean, they basically existed from the spring until the summer. Yeah.
With Shaw.
So there was no Christmas.
So there was no Christmas scene. But again, you got to be a real loser to even notice this stuff.
Yeah.
But stuff like that. The one thing about Shaw that doesn't come out in the movie, they're not going to talk about, is he was not an abolitionist. He came around.
No.
He came around later. His parents were big time Boston abolitionists. But Shaw was Spalding Smails of Caddyshack. He was a spoiled, rich little brat who was going to school in Europe, who ended up fighting in Antietam. And he came back, and the Shaws thought it'd be cool if their kid ran a regiment, and he didn't want to do it. He did not want to do it. He didn't sit there outside with that actor, Cary Hughes, and go, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it.
I can't stand Cary Elwes.
It took some time. It took some time for him to come around on that.
Yeah. And
even that he didn't, when he was at Camp Meigs up the street here, he was still not a fan. It wasn't until really, they really got down to South Carolina, he realized that these guys could fight. And the problem was he got killed, and he didn't really get to tell a story. He didn't get to go off to a lusty with them and to have a post-war story, because his story would have been good to tell, but he had to come around. And that's the one historical part of the movie that's obviously incorrect. And they weren't going to paint Robert Gould Shaw or Ferris Bueller there as being kind of indifferent or a snob or a
they're
little
not.
brat.
They have to, and Derek said, history movies are important, and whatever gets people to look back at history is positive. Joaquin Phoenix is 5'8" though, and is a short kid. I'm offended. LOL. Napoleon stood 5'4", so obviously Joaquin Phoenix isn't the same height. But again, that doesn't matter as long as he's portraying, as long as the movie's entertaining. I had a really I took classical studies, and I had one prof, Derek, who loved the movie Gladiator. I had another prof, Craig, who hated it. Craig hated it because it was not historically accurate. Derek, I think his name was Derek. He loved it because he said, he's like, you know what? It's not historically accurate. It's like a what if movie, but you know what? I was entertained the entire time and I really enjoyed it, and I'm not going to feel bad about it, even though some people like to make me feel bad about it because I'm a classical studies professor. It's the same with, the movie Gettysburg. It's a great movie, but take it with a grain of salt.
No, I mean, for one, I don't share your love of Gladiator. I think it sucks, but that is what it is. I hate Russell Crowe. He's such a dick. But anyway, but Gettysburg is a fair point though. Is it does tell the story, but there's too many people who think that movie is a documentary. Even the Ken Burns documentary is not 100% accurate. There are things about it that's wrong, but the movie Gettysburg, it certainly has some flaws. But as long as it gains interest and you study it, you realize that there are some differences. It's not game-changing situations. It's not like the big dance number at the end or anything,
It's like anything, and there are these, the movie Copperhead, which we love. Is it historically accurate? We're not sure, but it is a great movie. I know David Maxwell loves that movie too, Copperhead.
That is a good movie.
And it's one of those movies, you watch it a second and third time, it just gets better and better and better. It is such a good telling of the home front story. And the other one too, that is Gone with the Wind and its place in Civil War history. I know people that hate it. I know people that love it. I have to read the book, and Miranda, I think, and you've said too, the book is it's good. It's worth reading.
The book is good. The movie, the first half is really, really good. The second half kind of goes off a little bit, but the book is actually very, very good. Yeah. I mean, take it for a grain of salt. I mean, it's But
I remember watching it or talking about the Civil War with my family one time and mentioning Sherman. They're like, isn't he that a-hole from Gone with the Wind that was torturing everybody? I'm like,
well, that's what was brilliant about the book and the movie, but it was kind of like the movie Cloverfield, where you don't see the enemy, where you don't see the monster. I mean, you do at the end, but for the most part, you don't see it. You just see remnants of it, and that's what you see. The scene Scarlett O'Hara is looking up, you see the glow of the fires, and that's Sherman's coming. But what that movie did was very much like what Mary Chestnut's Diary did. Is it put you into the mindset of how they felt at the time. Yeah. Mitchell, she dies in 1949. She's got a weird death where she's basically
hit by a car.
The story is that she was drunk walking up the street in Atlanta, walked into traffic and hit by a car and died. There's actually a picture for online of her dead in the street if you're morbid. But she that book was obviously a huge historical novel. I saw somebody was mentioning the Ralph Peters books here a little while ago. Gettysburg's a good one too. But those series are really, really good. And yes, they are novels. They're not 100% accurate, true, but neither are the diaries, because the diaries are firsthand perspective of what they thought. And a lot of the stories that they talk about aren't really real, but you can be entertained by them. You can read Cain at Gettysburg, and they talk about funeral scenes, burying soldiers. And the way they do it, it's probably not 100% how it was really done on the field, but it puts you in the moment. It's vivid. It puts you in the spot so you can get a better feel for what it may have been like. And that's what Ralph Peters does a good job about that. He's really, really good. Shelby Foote wrote a couple of books he wrote a book on Shiloh, which was historical. It was a historical book, but he also was kind of a novel too. Yeah. Stars in Their Courses about Gettysburg was kind of like that too, where it's a little bit off kilter, a little bit, but you can read them and learn from them. There's no question.
Jeff Shaar is the same way. And the one I always recommend to people, and I need to read Peter's books because Frank and I think Paul mentioned that they're better than Shaar's. But Smoke at Dawn is one of my favorites because it's got Sherman, it's got Claiborne, it's got Bragg, and he writes them all so well, but he writes it very vividly. Like there's one scene where Claiborne they're up on Missionary Ridge and he's off his horse. It's raining and he's got under this tree root and he's kneeling down with his binoculars, a lot like that statue. Remember the statue we saw of him?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's kneeling down and he's looking out over the Union Army. And Lucius Polk comes to talk to him. And they have this discussion and they kind of get into a fight. And Clayburn gets really angry with him. You can see it vividly happening. Like Clayburn suddenly, like, you know, standing up and saying, like, you need to go now. And there's one scene too where Clayburn is up talking to Longstreet, and Longstreet is telling him, like, well, I'm leaving now. And Clayburn's like, but we're going to do battle and we need your troops. And Longstreet's like, thoughts and prayers, I'm going back. Shannon mentioned something I did not know. This is really interesting. Ron Maxwell's first choice for Chamberlain was Russell Crowe.
Yeah, I did know that.
Wow. Could you imagine?
No, Maxwell.
Maxwell.
Maxwell. If I remember correctly, I remember seeing this like behind the scenes on YouTube. If I remember correctly, that's the guy he wanted. Didn't want anybody else, and so he just waited on him. And then when it didn't happen, he ended up with Jeff Daniels. But I'm glad though.
Would have been good.
No, but you know what though? Well, Jeff Daniels played that very, very well. And the thing about Jeff Daniels is, you know, I don't know Jeff Daniels, but I know somebody who was friends with him, who dated the guy, Tom Berenger. And she lives here in the Cape, and she was telling me all these stories. And they during the movie Gettysburg, he's filming Gettysburg. His agent was telling him, because as soon as the movie ended, he was getting on an airplane to fly to California to film a movie called Dumb and Dumber. Yeah. And they were telling him point blank, don't do this movie. Don't do Dumb and Dumber. You're coming off this historical movie. Don't do it. And he's like, I'm going to do it. Who cares? It sounds like it'd be a lot of fun. And just some of the stories about, because she was there in Gettysburg when they were filming the movie in 1992. And so it's just one of those fascinating stories about how it is.
I don't know. I don't think Russell Crowe would have been bad, but I'm thinking some of the lines from
Gladiator. My problem with Gladiator, and nothing against the movie, I just can't stand Crowe. I anything he's in, I'm not going to like, because he's such a dick. I'm sorry.
I know that, but I mean, I'm a classical studies, like that's
I know.
What my degree is, so I love the movie.
No, if they put somebody else in that movie, I probably would have liked it. Admittedly, I'm a prejudiced man, Mary. I just don't like Crowe. I think he's an asshole. But in any case, that's fun though. But Daniels talks a lot about studying a lot about Chamberlain, about getting. He went up to Brunswick. He tried to get his mannerisms down. A lot of that speech, and this I've heard this. Yes and no about this, but the speech he gave to his troops, those Maine guys, was allegedly paraphrased from a real speech he gave, not in exact words, but that speech in that kind of context really happened. So he studied that, and they put that in the movie, and they got that scene in one take.
Yeah.
One take.
Really cool. I mean, Jeff Daniels does an amazing job. Paul's wondering, you don't even like Master and Commander? I love Master and Commander. I love Master and Commander.
With the longest title in history, Master and Commander, King of the Seas, and
that is one movie. Like that's like I don't like it. I have only seen like one Marvel movie, and I didn't like it, and so I'm pissed off at all the sequels, because Master and Commander is the one movie that I wanted sequels to.
No, and again, this is just a personal, whatever. Who cares? I mean, those movies are fine as they are, but it was good despite the fact this guy was in it. I never realized I had such a weird hatred.
Yeah, I didn't realize you had a weird hatred towards.
I never liked him, but as I talk about it now, I'm getting a little dangerous. I'm fired up.
Yeah, it's actually really.
So it's like hearing you talk about Zooey Deschanel.
I love her.
Just kidding, but that's the truth though. But there's so many cool stories about that. You know, Martin Sheen talks about when they were filming, when they finally showed the movie Gettysburg. I guess they opened it up in Atlanta, because Turner Films made the movie. And when they were kind of doing the premiere, they did it, and there was a guy a couple rows behind who was talking during the whole movie, explaining what was going to happen. And Sheen's getting all pissed off because this guy's giving away the freaking story.
Yeah.
So they had an intermission at the time. And intermission comes, and Sheen says he's going to turn around, he's going to say something to this guy, tell him to stop talking. He turns around, you know who it is? Jimmy Carter, who was a big Civil War guy. And he's like, oh shit. So, but if you go on YouTube and you do some of the Gettysburg movie interviews, in the blooper reel from Gettysburg is hilarious, by the way.
I need to watch that again. Frank said we should do a whole episode on Civil War movies.
We've actually talked about that. I think we have,
Should do that sometime.
and so it's these are fun things we can talk about. We try to.
There was
think of some
that one
different
from like
ideas.
the 1950s or something where it's like everybody at West Point that was not at West Point at the same time.
Well, what the hell was that movie?
I don't know, but it's like I was reading the synopsis. I'm like, this is so bad. Like it's like
Well,
Custer is there.
well,
and
Robert E. Lee's a
Jeb
student
Stuart. Yeah,
with
Robert.
Jeb Stewart, with
Yeah.
Grant. They're all together. It's kind of like Animal House, but it's all the Civil War people, but it's real. They try to be serious about it. We gotta. God, we were supposed to do something. We were supposed to do like a movie
like
watch
a bad
night.
movie night or something.
We have to do that. We've been talking about that for years. We have to do that.
Yeah.
Just kind of a movie watch.
Yeah. Oh, Derek's got, can either of you recommend a good intermediate book to start studying the Western theater? Good question. I would say like the Western theater is more battle specific.
Yeah.
There is a good book it's about the Army of Tennessee, and it tells about how mismanaged they are. And that's actually good background to have going into it. But anything by Dave Powell with Chickamauga.
That's the problem, is that it's such a big, vast, because you've got Trans Mississippi, you've got the true Western theater, but the Western theater is dominated. I mean, I think a good probably book, if you read Groom's book on Vicksburg, that's a good one, because he's the guy who wrote Forrest Gump, by the way. He talks a lot about the Western theater lead up to it. So
does Donald L. Miller in his Vicksburg book too.
But I would say I would start with one of those. I mean, you could read Grant's memoirs to talk about it, but it's his memoirs. But I still think the Grant memoirs are fantastic. But try the Groom book. I think that because he spends, you're halfway through the book before he even gets into Vicksburg.
Yeah, so he talks a lot about background to the Western theater, and again, the book about it's a book about Army of Tennessee, and the title is escaping me right now.
But he's talking because he talks all about the experiences in Cairo, Illinois, Henry and Donaldson, Corinth. He talks about the lead up to it, and which is really the beginning of the Western theater. And then once Vicksburg ends, it ends. But you could pick up Southern Storm, Mary, if you want to read about the March of the Sea. You could talk about that one. Is that Noah Andre? That's Trudeau?
Noah Andre Trudeau.
Okay.
The book about Army of Tennessee is by Larry J. Daniel, and it's just called Concord.
Yep.
And it's a great Paul, we were talking about Nothing But Victory. Not that one, but that was another one to suggest. I was talking about Concord by Larry J. Daniel. If you want to drill down into some of the stuff about the Atlanta campaign, then Earl J. Hess. Anything by Western Theater, Tim Smith is a great read, and he's also a great guy. He was so fun.
You have to, when you're talking to Western theater, that's like a book about the Eastern theater, because you got everything from the McClellan to Bull Run to Gettysburg. So it's a big, vast thing. But I think if you start with the Groom book, that's a good place to start, because it'll give you a good primer to it. And and the book drops off right at Vicksburg's ending, so you can pick that up, and you can, if you want to pick up the next book, you can talk about some of the books leading to the Atlanta campaign. Eventually leading to that. But
Chickamauga, like anything. Dave Powell's got a really great trilogy on Chickamauga.
Dave Powell's the guru in Chickamauga, obviously.
And Tullahoma. He and Wittenberg have a book about Tullahoma.
You mentioned Tim Smith.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of the stuff. That's just such a vast, wide type of thing you can talk about. But those things, I mean, you really have to do them justice. So if you read the Groom book, you'll get a good flavor for it. But then you'll be more interested in reading about what happens afterwards, which of course is Stones River, Tullahoma, Chattanooga, Atlanta, March of the Sea, Bentonville. It kind of does that whole thing right up if you follow Sherman and Grant. But it is fascinating. But what's interesting when you get towards the end is it's all moving together.
Yeah, they're all starting to come together.
Right. So you got Grant doing his thing in the east. You got Sherman doing his thing. And everything's moving in concert with each other. It's like a perfect, like a snake that's twisting around the Confederacy, and it really all starts with Vicksburg. So I would definitely read the Vicksburg book, because that sets up, because the Western theater makes a lot more sense when you read about how hard it was to take Vicksburg. And what a big effort that was.
Yeah. And between Groom and Donald Miller, and then if you really want to drill down into Vicksburg, I think Tim Smith has like a trilogy. That's the first and second book are out about it.
Yeah.
And Tony mentions the one I mentioned too, Earl J. Hess, for anything on the Atlanta campaign. He's got books about, Kennesaw, Peachtree Creek. Ezra.
I thought Powell had the Chickamauga trilogy.
I was talking about the Atlanta campaign, Earl J. Hess.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, Powell has the Chickamauga
right
trilogy as well, which is really good. Wiley Sword has one about what happens to the command after Chickamauga, which is really good. And then there's the emerging Civil War books.
Yeah, there's a bunch. Anyway, we should get ready to jump off. It's that time.
Yeah, it is.
You mentioned.
Yeah, have a great weekend. Yeah, have a great weekend, Paul.
You mentioned Wiley Sword, so somewhere Joe Ricci's bat signal's going off, so we should probably stop it at that.
Yeah,
point.
Well, that's the other thing too is don't if you can find a book about the Battle of Franklin. I like 5 Tragic Hours. There's another good book that was written by somebody who works for Battle of Franklin Trust as well that came out recently. Battle of Franklin is definitely one that needs to be studied. It is like, as you say, it's senseless tragedy that happens.
It is. It certainly is. So, all right. So we got some things afoot at the Circle K coming up here pretty soon.
We will announce soon. Oh, Bjorn just came on here.
Hey Bjorn, what's going on, man? Hey Bjorn.
Bookshop.
So Bjorn, we got to talk to you soon. We're doing an event here on the 22nd of September that we're doing trivia for the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg. So we want to talk to you about perhaps getting some updated books for the awards for that. So we'll reach out to you about that. Because that we're doing it where Spawn help them with their cannons and cocktails and cannonballs events, which is Friday, September 22nd. And you should absolutely go if you're on this. If you're watching this, it's a night where they're going to do a nighttime cannon demonstration. There's going to be all kinds of artifacts out. There's going to be wine, beer. There's going to be Civil War food. There's going to be cigars. Yeah. It's going to be the big social event in the area, probably in the fall. So definitely check that out. But we've been asked to do the trivia. So we're very honored to do that.
Yeah, Bjorn says, sure thing. Yeah, we'll be in touch with you about that. And so Bjorn does mention Tim Smith is writing 5 books about Vicksburg and he's releasing his 4th. I really want, once I'm done grad school, I want to tackle all those books. Frank mentions It's for Cause and Country by Jacobson is one of the best books about Frank.
Right.
Yep. And Derek, I have that book too on Franklin. I think it's called If We Are to Die Like Men or something. It's good and it's got the driving tour in it. But yeah, something like if you read 5 Tragic Hours and For Cause and Country, you're going to be covering a pretty good overview of what happens at Franklin.
Franklin's great. All right. So we got the book club coming up. We're going to be doing Tom Huntington's Maine at Gettysburg.
We just have to confirm a date for that.
We got to schedule that, and we'll be doing a roundtable here pretty soon. So, but in all seriousness, go on to the National Civil War Museum's website and look up their events. It's on social media. It's like every proceeds go towards the museum. This is a self-sustaining museum. And it's right in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and they're going to be doing their big gala, and people are going to be dressing up in period clothes, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you are in the area, or you're looking for something to do, look at that event and go. It's like $75 a person or something like that. So it's not expensive, but it's not cheap, but it's a great night.
It's a fundraiser for them. And Barbara asked, is this live or can it be viewed online? Unfortunately, it's just a live event.
Yeah.
We're not going to be, I don't think we're going to be able to live stream anything. We'll probably post like photos. Maybe if we have a chance, we'll do like a Facebook Live from there as we're at the event to show everybody what's going on at it.
This is not our gig. This is their thing. So we don't know, we know what we can and can't do, but we're going to have a lot of fun with it. So hopefully you can come. If not, there'll be definitely a lot of pictures. So we'll definitely look forward to that. All right. So let's jump off. So guys, enjoy the rest of your day. It's starting to get hot and steamy here as usual now. So I bet you, Mary, we can go find a beer at a bar somewhere this afternoon. I bet you we can.
So too. Yeah,
I bet you we can.
We will be back next weekend with a live, probably on Sunday because we have plans on Saturday. Not going to Vermont, but we're going to do something else.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. We're going to see the Jaws stop at Martha's Vineyard next Saturday. Yeah. That's what we're going to do. Yeah. We're going to need a bigger boat. Yeah. Nice. Anyway. All right. So anyway, you guys have a great rest of the weekend. Thanks for jumping on. Check out the episode. On here.
Check out the episode.
If you haven't, check it out.
It's on YouTube and it's on, wherever you get your audio podcast from as well.
I mean, we got done with that last time. Mary had to be hosed down. She was so excited about talking about Old Howard. It was a lot of fun. But his story is great, like a lot of these guys' stories we talk about. So definitely check it out. So again, we appreciate the support. We really, really do. So we will look forward to seeing you all on the other side. Mary,
Yep.
we'll see you in about 30 seconds.